So I gave my sermon an urban kick. My rhymes are fly, my beats are sick. My crew is big and it keeps getting bigger. That's 'cause Jesus Christ is my
metaphysical substrate of our culture.
During their chat back in May, Jordan Peterson and Matt Dillahunty discussed psychedelics and their relation to supernatural experience. Over the course of that portion of the conversation, Peterson made several claims, specifically about psilocybin use, smoking cessation, and scientific methodology, which I think have evaded proper scrutiny for far too long. In defending his ideas on the supernatural, Peterson made claims about the realm of science that do a bit more than just fail to hold up. This portion of the conversation begins with Matt Dillahunty explaining the problematic nature of investigating the supernatural. We'll start there. There's a bit of context to get through, so just bear with me.
I would never construe it as a scientific issue because science can't confirm the supernatural. I mean, we are blocked until somebody demonstrates a mechanism by which we can explore and confirm the existence of the supernatural and then confirm that it actually can impact the natural world. We're stuck, which is why science relies on methodological naturalism.
You seem to be able to do it with psychedelic drugs.
You seem to be able to do what with psychedelic drugs?
Well, everybody that takes them under reliable settings generally comes back and claims the presence of a mystical experience.
Yeah,
and that seems to be duplicatable and replicable across cultures, in labs, with multiple different substances, the chemical constituents of which are known very well. It's like it's part of this religious phenomenology, and to me that's just a set of facts.
I fully agree that people take drugs and report experiences that they describe as mystical or supernatural. Just like people report other experiences as if they were religious or ghosts or whatever. We have no way of confirming that this something mystical or supernatural actually happened. What this is about the language.
Stops people from smoking.
Well, you can stop smoking without any sort of supernatural intervention.
No, not really.
You can't stop smoking without supernatural?
There aren't really any reliable chemical means for inducing smoking cessation. You can use a drug called bupropion. I think that's the one. It's whatever Wellbutrin is.
Is that supernatural?
No, you don't need a supernatural effect, but it doesn't work very well. But if you give people magic mushrooms, psilocybin, and they have a mystical experience, they have about an 85% chance of smoking cessation with one treatment. But that's kind of like evidence, you know.
Peterson rattles off several statements about psilocybin here, which act as his justification for his response to Matt.
You can stop smoking without any sort of supernatural intervention.
No, not really.
The problem is, a lot of these statements don't check out. If we examine the current literature behind the claim that
if you give people magic mushrooms, psilocybin, and they have a mystical experience, they have about an 85% chance of smoking cessation with one treatment.
We immediately discover the claim's flaws. Peterson seems to be citing a 2014 study out of Johns Hopkins University published in the Journal of Psychopharmacology, which involved controlled administration of psilocybin and a measure of smoking cessation. After 6 months, 80% of participants had abstained from smoking. In reference to the mechanism thought to be at play here, the researcher is quoted as having said, "When administered after careful preparation and in the therapeutic context, psilocybin can lead to deep reflection about one's life and spark motivation to change." However, this trial utilized controlled doses of psilocybin in conjunction with regular cognitive behavioral therapy sessions, both administered multiple times for over 8 weeks. The study also involved only 15 participants. Because of that tiny sample size, the researcher themselves didn't even imply that their results were conclusive. All scientists, including this researcher, know that such tiny sample sizes allow for huge margins of error. So studies this small should never be treated as such reliable evidence as Peterson makes this study out to be. And as for that with one treatment statement, that's misrepresentation on Peterson's part on the order of total fabrication. This study involved multiple doses of psilocybin administered over several weeks within a therapeutic setting, along with a rigorous course of cognitive behavioral therapy. Not only did the treatment involve multiple doses, but the study never even intended to test psilocybin's efficacy alone. It tested the efficacy of a comprehensive course of treatment, which involved psilocybin use as just one of its features. So Peterson's matter-of-fact statements on this research are a massive misrepresentation. His further statements about what scientific research on psychedelics can tell us about the supernatural may be even more dubious, though.
It's kind of like evidence.
It's evidence that you can take mushrooms and increase your chance of quitting smoking. But
no, it's not. It's indication that if you take mushrooms and you have a mystical experience, you'll you'll stop smoking because it doesn't work if you
Okay,
don't have
if
the
you take
experience.
mushrooms and you have an experience that you describe as mystical, then you'll increase your chance of smoking. But that doesn't tell me whether or not there was something to this notion that they had an experience that was supernatural in any sense.
Well, it's not definitive evidence. Okay. You have a pharmacological substance, it's psilocybin. You give it to people who are trying to quit smoking. The psilocybin doesn't directly have an impact on the smoking behavior. It has to elicit what's described subjectively as a mystical experience. And you can get physiological indicators of that mystical experience.
There's a bit more relevant research that Jordan appears to be referencing here. In 2017, an article in the Journal of Psychopharmacology detailed the results of a retrospective cross-sectional anonymous online survey of 358 individuals who reported having quit or reduced smoking after ingesting psychedelics in non-laboratory settings. 38% of individuals reported continuous smoking cessation after psychedelic use. Changes in life priorities and values were endorsed as the most important psychological factor associated with smoking cessation or reduction. We have a fair bit of reason to say that we suspect that changes in life priorities spurred on by psychedelic-influenced meaningful experiences may aid in smoking cessation. But to say that supernatural experiences are needed to quit smoking is just unfounded, to say the least. It seems that no studies have had controls in place to isolate supernatural or just meaningful experiences, or even psilocybin use, as the variable to be tested in reference to smoking cessation. The second article we discussed described a survey, which definitionally has no variable isolating controls in place, while the first article detailed a study which tested a comprehensive treatment program. So how can we know the meaningful experience was the most influential factor here? In the first study, the one Peterson cites, could it have been the CBT? Was it actually chemically induced? Was it the high level of attention and care the participants got? Was it the first long-term treatment the participants had ever gotten due to this treatment's affordability? Was it a combination of all of that? The point is, we don't actually know, and won't know until a large sample, randomized controlled trial is performed on psilocybin. But even then, the possibility that there might be a chemical mechanism which causes inhibition of addictive behavior would remain. After all, the cause of that inhibition could actually be a chemical change within the brain following psilocybin use, with a deeply meaningful experience simply being a byproduct. It would be difficult to determine exactly which factor is the cause of smoking cessation, requiring experimentation more complex than I even have a handle on because I'm not a neuroscientist. Bear in mind that so far we've treated Peterson's use of supernatural experience as if it means a deeply meaningful experience which spurs changes in life priorities and values, which is the way the researchers in the relevant literature define that factor. But ultimately, Peterson isn't quite saying this. He seems to really be referring to the actual supernatural, and that is an absolutely massive issue with his dialogue on this subject. If we wanted to run scientific tests to determine whether or not actual supernatural experiences are an influence on smoking cessation, the way that Peterson acts as if scientists have already done, we absolutely couldn't. Science abides firmly by methodological naturalism, an approach in study that investigates and describes the natural causes behind events in the natural world. Matt is correct in what he says here.
I would never construe it as a scientific issue because science can't confirm the supernatural. I mean, we are blocked until somebody demonstrates a mechanism by which we can explore and confirm the existence of the supernatural and then confirm that it actually can impact the natural world. We're stuck, which is why science relies on methodological naturalism.
Jordan's implication that we can demonstrate anything about the supernatural through scientific study goes entirely against the idea of methodological naturalism upon which scientific practice is based. Unfortunately, in the context of the conversation, that seems to be his whole point. Even if research on this topic really was on Peterson's side in the way that he thinks it is, it still wouldn't and couldn't demonstrate that actual supernatural experiences are involved in the usage of psychedelics. Ironically, Matt Dillahunty, the person in this conversation who is not a scientist, but more of a philosopher and communicator, is the one who represents the philosophy of scientific methodology better.
It's indication that if you take mushrooms and you have a mystical experience, you'll stop smoking because it doesn't work if you don't have
if
the
you
experience.
take mushrooms and you have an experience that you describe as mystical, then you'll increase your chance of smoking. But that doesn't tell me whether or not there was something to this notion that they had an experience that was supernatural in any sense.
Finally, here's where perhaps the most problematic of Jordan's points in this part of the conversation are voiced. When Matt makes the point we just saw him make, Peterson makes a clever but somewhat deceptive move.
That they had an experience that was supernatural in any sense.
Well, it's not definitive evidence. Okay, you have a pharmacological substance, it's psilocybin. You give it to people who are trying to quit smoking. The psilocybin doesn't directly have an impact on the smoking behavior. It has to elicit what's described subjectively as a mystical experience. And you can get physiological indicators of that mystical experience. And you might say, well, that's not enough to prove that it's a mystical experience, but, you're conscious and I accept that. It's like you accept all sorts of things without being able to demonstrate their validity on every possible objective, with every possible objective criteria. So don't get in too much of a hurry. It's a serious issue.
Essentially, he repeats the supposed findings of scientific research on the issue, which we now know he's misrepresenting. And then to the objection that science can't provide any sufficient evidence for us to believe in the supernatural, Peterson directly says,
you're conscious and I accept that. It's like you accept all sorts of things without being able to demonstrate their validity on every possible objective with every possible objective criteria.
So his defense on this entire point comes down to, well, you believe other things without fully developed, reliable scientific evidence, so you can believe this too. This is a total dodge. We're specifically talking about science here. Peterson himself started that. We're talking about what science can show us. Peterson brought up scientific findings in the first place to demonstrate his idea that science can provide us evidence of the supernatural, and thus that we should believe in the supernatural. But this is his escape from his error when it's demonstrated that his evidence and argument involving science definitionally can't support his conclusion involving the supernatural. But this dodge is problematic too. Why is it okay to see holes in one's epistemology, excuse them, and then continue believing something based on that epistemology? Why not see the holes, acknowledge them, and say we're not sure about the belief until we can fix those holes legitimately? This is just basic intellectual honesty. I've said it once and I'll say it again. Jordan is supposed to be, in at least some sense, a science communicator. And in this discussion, he misrepresented important issues enough to mislead all those who accepted his statements as truth. This isn't a simple mistake. This is an absolutely glaring oversight combined with some probable dishonesty that's damaging when it comes from someone of his level of education, prestige, and influence. I'm obviously not saying that because he messed up here, he must be wrong about everything else or is a habitual liar. But what I am saying is that a lot of people give Jordan Peterson's claims a ton of weight because of his current status. And sometimes they give him too much credit and are seriously misled, like a lot of people have been on this issue. So, before taking a side, maybe do some fact-checking. Peterson is an accomplished guy, but as I'm sure we can all admit, he can be wrong. And in this case, he was. Thanks for watching. I've been Drew of Genetically Modified Skeptic. I want to take a second to thank everyone that's helped me build my new studio. Thank you to Jonathan at the Epsilon Prime Foundation for helping me afford the place and for purchasing my lights. A long overdue thank you to Phil, one of my sponsors, for buying me a computer, which is actually capable of editing without crashing, unlike the computer I started out on. I used it for about a year, by the way. Of course, thank you to my patrons for basically paying me a salary so that I can do this full time. And a massive thanks to my top patron, Adam. He makes the difference on my Patreon that allows me to keep working as a full-time YouTuber. There's a reason I call him my personal Lord and Savior in every video. As always, subscribe, check out my Patreon, follow me on Twitter and Facebook at GM Skeptic, and until next time, stay skeptical.